Okay, so the last section of this video is basically wrapping up everything that we've talked about to this point in user interface design, going back to the initial inputs and outputs. So as you are thinking about the inputs that your user may provide, it's very important to understand whether and when to use batch inputs versus individual manual inputs. So a good example would be something like photo editing. There may be some standard edits that you would want to apply to a huge number of photos. You don't want to have to do that manually over and over and over again. And so for a photo editing software suite, you may want to include controls and affordances to allow for batch editing. For something else, for non-photo software, that may not make sense, right? There may be very few instances where you would need to do the same operation applied to lots and lots of different inputs simultaneously. Typically, you want to try and get the input design such that the source is as close to the system as possible, as direct as possible. Sometimes this means actually giving the user the ability to connect some sort of automated input for providing input to your application. A good example of this might be something like for budgeting software. A lot of websites, banks, and Amazon and various other places will allow you to download your order history as a CSV file that's compatible with a wide number of other budgeting applications. They're just trying to make that input as easy as possible on you, the user. This is an important part of efficiency because GUI inputs are maybe more difficult or time-consuming than a text-based input or a command line input might be. It makes a big difference if you have good default values and if there's some automated logical ordering of inputs so that it's very easy for the user to know what input was provided in what order. And then the last big critical design principle for inputs, you must validate inputs. This is absolutely critical for security and for usability. If inputs are invalid, it could break later stages of the application with unusual error messages that the user would not be able to recover from. That's actually the good case, the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that input validation leads to security problems that your application would now be vulnerable to. So make sure that whenever you are accepting input from the user, that it is actually what you're expecting it to be and nothing more. All right, output design is a little bit less complicated than input design, but it's still important to understand the audience task and context. If you miss on any one of those things, you can actually create an application that just raises questions in the user's mind rather than solving problems the user has. It's also important to avoid information overload. You don't want to just spam the user with a ton of output all at once. It's important to know how much output the user is expecting and then to try and match that with the amount of output you're providing. It's also useful to give options to the user if you do have quite a bit of input as to how they would like to see it, how they would like to address it. It's also important to watch for bias, especially given that you are designing the application. You know more about the domain than many of your users will, and you don't want to bias the outputs in such a way that the user isn't able to make fair decisions or that they're kind of encouraged to do things that would be unhealthy for them. This is a usability problem that has become more problematic as the ecosystem has trended more towards behavioral advertising and privacy invasive techniques that are essentially asking the user to provide tons of information, and then you're calculating some output without telling them exactly how that was calculated or what information it was based on. And then the user kind of has to just accept whatever the algorithm says. This sort of bias problem is probably only going to get more complicated until we come up with better principles for understanding ethics and technology. Right now, most technology designers are failing at this particular piece of the puzzle. All right, well, as I said at the very beginning, there is a lot more to the story for user experience design. This is not even remotely the end of the discussion. I've got a couple of links here that you'd be able to follow for the slides when they're uploaded to Blackboard. These are definitely required reading for this class. The first link in particular, this user testing link on exactly what is user experience design and defining user experience design. I like the definition that's quoted above here, where user experience design is the process of designing either digital or physical products that are useful, easy to use, and delightful to interact with. It's a very good explanation of how that differs from user interface design. And it's the sort of thing that I think many of you, especially those of you in the HCC program, probably are really here to do. That's really the whole purpose of this. And this is where user experience fits in the broader context. I'll also recommend for those of you who are interested in this sort of thing, this textbook on contextual design. I interacted with this as a postdoc when I was at Georgia Tech, and I think this is a really good introduction to understanding how to design systems for customers. It's not the kind of thing that I would recommend lightly because I'm not a researcher in user experience design, and I found this to be very, very helpful in crafting and understanding how exactly we should be eliciting requirements for customers and designing systems for them. I'd also provide this additional reading, also optional, just like the contextual design textbook, for those of you who are interested in command line interfaces. I said earlier on that design is not just about GUI interfaces or web-based interfaces, that even command line interfaces need to be designed and designed well. And there is actually quite a bit that goes into the design of a good command line interface. It is not simply something that you just do and then you're done with. Unfortunately, many command line applications are not designed by anyone with background in user experience design. And so there's lots of inconsistencies, lots of problems in terms of output overload, other issues that we've discussed here today that make command line interfaces a little bit less palatable for a lot of folks. But really well done command line applications can be as usable, if not more so, than graphical applications. All right, that's everything that we have for user interface design or user interfaces. That concludes all of the material that we wanted to cover in Lecture 8. I'll be online from 4:30 to 7 during our usual class time for office hours and discussion on these slides. I know they're not going to be posted until roughly that time anyway, but that'll be a regular weekly occurrence, so we'll be able to get into more discussions in the upcoming weeks. Thanks.